Howdy everybody. We are here today to take a look at my number 2 favorite thing to do when I'm on Galveston Island. Now this is a series in preparation for the Battleship Texas to be moved to dry dock. People are going to be coming in from different parts of the country and maybe from out of the country and not familiar with Galveston Island. So I started this series to let everybody know what there actually is to see and do in Galveston before you get there, so you can make your plans. Now, if you have not seen my previous 2 videos in this series, the first was on the history of Galveston Island, a real brief history, and the second was on my number 1 favorite thing to do in Galveston. If you have not seen those, I will link to them in the description box. Now, my number 2 thing, just like my number 1 thing, is going to be a shocker to most, if not all of you. But my number 2 thing to do on Galveston Island when I'm there is visit the cemeteries. Kind of freaky, huh? Not really, not so much, not when you know why. Galveston Island, before it had cemeteries, back in the early 1830s and prior to that, was burying their dead in sand dunes on the beaches. Of course, we all can figure out what happened there. Storms and high seas would come in and wash the bodies out to sea, and then they'd wash back up on shore. So in 1839, Galveston allotted some land for the first cemetery. That cemetery is now known as the Old City Cemetery. When you're going into Galveston on Broadway, which is Highway 45, cuts right through Galveston, straight down to the beach and dead ends at the seawall. On the right-hand side, you will see this cemetery. There are parking spots for you to walk around the cemetery, look around, and you, like me, will soon realize that that is much more than a cemetery. It's a record of the history of Galveston Island. Now, toward the end of this video, I'm gonna link you to another video that is going to explain in great detail. It's very well done and it's not real long, 15 minutes I think, maybe 18. And it is an excellent video on the Old City Cemetery in Galveston. Now there are 28 cemeteries currently in Galveston. Many of them are very old, but the Old City Cemetery is the oldest of all of them, started in 1839. Now this is only 3 years after Texas became a state in 1836, when it defeated Santa Anna and the Mexican Army for Texas's independence. Texas at this time was its own country. It was not part of the United States. In 1839, Galveston was hit with a yellow fever, and this is what brought about the need for a cemetery where people could be buried somewhere besides on the beach and possibly or likely get washed out to the sea. Now, as you remember from my first video, Galveston Island suffered in 1900 the most devastating natural disaster to ever, up until current day still, hit the United States of America. At that time, the cemetery had been around for, 69 years, so it was full of graves already. And when the island was raised, if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and watch the first video. But when the island was raised, all the headstones were raised, if the family could afford to raise their headstone of their family members. If not, the headstones were simply buried or had dirt placed around them. There are several mausoleums that are now 6 to 8 feet underground with only the roof sticking above the ground. The cemetery has some very ornate headstones and carvings, beautiful headstones and carvings. Sad, of course, as to why they were placed, but beautiful nonetheless.
The Alberti family has one of the most poignant stories in Galveston. It's one of the only places that you'll find a murderess actually buried with her victims. Miss Alberti was married to a butcher in town, and they had quite a few children, were living happily, but she lost a son due to lockjaw, and then she lost a daughter when she was about 3 months old, and she fell into what we know now as postpartum depression, but people back then didn't know that. She was left at the home with 6 remaining children and her mother-in-law, while her husband would be next door at work at the butcher shop. And one day she invited the children to the table to sip a small glass of wine, which, although to our sensibilities today is strange, it wasn't that strange back then. She had poisoned the wine with arsenic, however. The oldest daughter was upstairs and she didn't hear her mother call, so she survived. The other 5 children were poisoned, and screaming in agony, their father came running to find them. By the time he called help, it was too late for 4 of the children. That's the first strange thing you'll notice about this stone, even though it's very plain, is that many of the death dates are the same. The headline the next day read 4 tiny coffins. The second to oldest daughter also survived. She was the only one that was poisoned and did survive. She and her sister are actually buried next to her parents. Elizabeth was taken to San Antonio to an insane asylum where she only remained a few years before she was returned to Galveston to live with her husband and her oldest daughter. But she couldn't take the guilt of realizing what she'd done, and she soon committed suicide as well. The one name that does not match on the very bottom of the stone is Elizabeth's sister, who also thankfully died before she witnessed all of this happening.
Now, thank you for coming along on this video. I hope you learned something. I hope you're interested in something. I would highly suggest that if you go to Galveston, you take the tour of the cemeteries. It's extremely informative and just very fascinating, or at least to me it is. And I know there's other folks out there like me. Cemeteries are not just cemeteries. They're history, living history. All you have to do is read the headstone and history just comes alive. Watch this video by Joe Perez. I will link to it. If you want to know more about the Old City Cemetery, watch this video here, Joe Perez with Texas Chronicles. If you want to know more about the Battleship Texas, watch that one there. And if you want to subscribe, and you do, just click on the circle right there. I appreciate everybody coming along. See you next time.